Today we have like 3 kind of extensions on the paper. Like the paper was super nice and very detailed, so we've kind of covered different aspects of climate injustice, and then we'll have like a couple of questions at the end before passing on to everyone else to ask more questions.
I mean, we prepared a summary of your 2 papers, but since your whole talk right now was just also a summary of your 2 papers, I think maybe we skip those and go straight away to our extensions.
So the first extension, I'll focus kind of more on like the political context and also on climate displacement. So kind of thinking more about the role of politics in distributional climate justice. I mean, this is stuff that you guys know, but like achieving distributional climate justice can't occur without engaging in politics. And also distributional justice is politically produced and also exacerbated by fascism. This is politics right now. So thinking about like welfare policies and exclusion, I think anytime we talk about like redistribution policies, it's really important that we think about who is actually included in those policies, and how there's kind of like this current turn to really like getting rid of the rights in terms of welfare for immigrants within the right, and in general, like the exclusionary characteristics of welfare systems are like hardly a new thing. Like you can trace these back like way back in history, and also there's a lot of academic literature that has been around for like a very long time. And then also thinking about how even having a welfare system is something that is not available for like all countries because of really, really intense debt and austerity conditions in loans. And the right doesn't really love climate science. And if they do, there's also another strand of literature that kind of investigates how kind of climate migration and displacement is used to then justify the enforcement of borders as well. So there's a quote on the slide here from this paper where they say the spectre of climate exodus has been mobilized also to justify border militarization and reinforce racial lines. And then this other paper refers to some extra literature that refers to the fact that like actually most climate displaced people in the global south will resettle within the same country in a different region or in a neighboring global south country, and actually like the global south hosts like 85% of climate refugees, of the world's refugees. And then thinking more broadly about like climate displacement as well, this is not just like something that like anti-immigration rhetoric within the right is kind of very unevenly distributing, but also kind of across other areas. So this author, she talks about national security, kind of like what we were just talking about before, but she also critiques the humanitarian approach because it depicts displaced people as like passive victims that need charity, and completely kind of depoliticizes and obscures like global north's responsibility in those situations. And then also thinking about like this migration management approach where refugees and migrants are kind of like seen as this as like economic opportunity and entrepreneurial migrants, which shifts the burden of adaptation onto vulnerable populations and then provides the global north with exploitable labor. And the author of this paper, she connects this more into the theory around like racialized capitalism and climate colonialism. So just briefly on this, racial capitalism is kind of thinking about how racism is not just about bias and discrimination, but also an integral part of a world system that subjects growing segments of the world's population to precarity and premature death. So carbon capitalism and colonial displacement have enriched the global north and made the global south like disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. She also points to how climate displacement is inadequately addressed by the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. And also, like at the moment, like international refugee law just doesn't recognize climate displacement as a category at all. So just briefly to summarize, redistributory welfare policies are not available to everyone. Racist anti-immigration policies have made this worse, and eco-fascists use climate displacement to justify the securitization of borders. achieving distributional equity requires engaging with this kind of political landscape of racialized capitalism, and also addressing racialized capitalism requires change at the level of institutions, law, and policy.
Thank you, Verity. In my part, I will be focusing on health as one of non-economic dimensions of inequality. So on this slide, you can see how climate change first leads to physical climate impacts, which then through different channels leads to several health impacts. Now, when we talk about global north, it is mostly still about the high temperatures and how they lead to heat-related causes of illnesses and non-communicable diseases. But talking about global south, they are already faced today with all of these physical climate impacts. So they also have vector-borne diseases that are becoming more and more prominent, and also waterborne diseases. Now, as it was already stressed by Céline, some groups are specifically more vulnerable. Sorry. And the reason for that is because of sensitivity, exposure, and adaptive capacity. Now, sensitivity refers to pre-existing conditions that are resulting from systematic neglect. And then we have exposure, which is determined by occupation and residence. And finally, there is adaptive capacity, which are the financial resources available to deal with climate shocks. Now, the studies that are out there show that low-income populations and black communities in high-income countries are disproportionately more affected by the increases in temperatures. And when it comes to the adaptive capacities, when we look at the countries that show similar geographical stances between the high-income and low-income countries, it is very much different outcomes based on the financial resources available in terms of both morbidity, mortality, and at the end, displacements. And when we connect it all back to our presentation and justice, first we can connect it to the distributive justice, but this is something that Verity already covered in the great deal in her part. So when we move to the social justice, or better to say social injustice, there is structural biases and underpinning forms of exclusion and oppression that drive unequal health outcomes. Also, something that is very often ignored are historical injustices, colonialism, and oppression of certain races, which leads to different health outcomes that are still felt today. And finally, there is intergenerational justice, which is already today, in Global South, the impacts are felt, but future generations are going to be much more impacted. So when we look at it at the global scale, most of reported disasters are happening in the developing economies, but even more reported deaths are in the developing economies. So climate change is a big burden on Global South, both in terms of morbidity and mortality. Now, on local level, one of the most affected populations is definitely the urban poor, which is around 1 billion people that live in informal settlements in developing countries. They have numerous pre-existing problems, which combined with climate change really amplify the health risks.
Yes, so thank you, Jana. And now I'm doing the third extension to our talk, which is about procedural climate justice. So we have heard both in the presentation from Céline and here about lots of ideas of substantive injustice and also social injustice, which would result from like the ordering or hierarchical structure of social systems, and procedural injustice or procedural climate justice is one element of those structural social injustices, which is about the fairness of decision-making process in climate policy, which relates to this fourth point that you mentioned, Céline. And in the following, I'm going to try to make a point why procedural justice might be worth looking at. And so when you look in the literature of climate ethicists, one thing that they regularly discuss is this idea of reasonable disagreement. And the diagnosis is that in this whole UN COP process, there would be a stalemate, and this would result because there's a disagreement on the distribution of carbon budget. And they would say, okay, this disagreement is not only because the actors are like selfish or only self-interested, but it also has a reasonable element in it. And reasonable disagreement, they define it as a disagreement due to differences in values and interpretations between actors who are otherwise cooperative and act in good faith. And this means that reasonable disagreement cannot solely be resolved by facts alone. And an example of this is, for example, if we look at how should global carbon budgets be distributed, maybe many people would agree, okay, we maybe need to distribute them according to historic responsibility. But then again, you can ask, like, who are actually the actors who are held accountable? Is it states? Is it companies? Is it individuals? Do we need a production consumption-based accounting? Since when? Since which date? So is there some excusable ignorance in the past? Do you need a grace budget for countries who have already overshot? And you see, like, those are all different positions where you can have reasonable, defendable positions based on different values. And therefore, this is where procedural justice comes in. The idea is that agreeing on procedural norms is easier for a reasonable actor than agreeing on the outcomes themselves. And therefore, the procedural process itself legitimizes the outcomes. For example, in democracy, you also agree to some laws being passed because you trust the democratic process, although you may not like the laws themselves. And examples for such norms of procedural justice would be, you would need an accuracy of reporting in this whole UN process. You need transparency, correctability in the light of new evidence, but also, and importantly, you would have to have equal negotiation capabilities. So the whole situation that you want to create is like a Habermasian ideal speech situation. And of course, countries don't have equal negotiation capabilities. They have different expertise, personnel, and so on. And those violations of procedural justice are therefore harder to reasonably justify. And if the climate movement focuses on those, then this could be like a leverage point for climate justice. And there have been some authors who try to quantify and operationalize like procedural justice in terms of the delegation size at the UN COPs. And you can see here, for example, there are some small island states which have like very low delegation sizes that they send there. And the idea is, okay, like the COPs are huge, massive events, and you need to have many people to send there to actually attend all the parallel sessions and to negotiate properly. And at the other end of the scale, you see some countries having like over 100 people sending there. There are also like countries who are sending over 300 people actually to the COP. And therefore, yeah, you have some different negotiation capabilities, and this can't be justified reasonably when you say, okay, we have different values on how to distribute the budget. Yeah, and then another point, which is becoming increasingly relevant, is that climate policy, global climate policy, seems to move away a little bit from the UN COPs. You see it with the EU CBAM, for example, which is the EU's main climate policy tool, and the CBAM doesn't only have negative impacts on the substantive distributional justice, but actually also violates the procedural justice norms because it was unilaterally designed and implemented without having like a global forum to discuss it and for other countries to participate in the decision-making process. And in general, like those global carbon pricing and climate clubs, who are maybe also like favored by some mainstream economists, don't have like this discursive element in there. There are also cases where the IMF prescribes carbon taxes as austerity measures, and it's just like a form of climate policy that is not well legitimized by a just process. And therefore, in the end, my argument would be with this development, we risk of losing the UN COPs as an important forum that allows for procedural justice, while at the same time, like, focusing on procedural justice is a good leverage for actually bringing forth climate policy. Yes, and with this we come to our discussion questions.
So my question was, what are the major barriers you perceive in ensuring I can't say this word, redistributionary policies adequately address climate inequality for all?
To what extent are climate vulnerabilities in low and middle income countries bad dependent on colonial and post-colonial economic structures?
Yeah, and I would ask if you think that procedural justice should receive a bigger attention in the empirical economic research. And as a personal question, whether you think that your research on inequality makes the world more just and has an impact. Thank you.
What I can do mainly is point you to some experts and to some literature that you might want to look at on those topics, rather than discuss myself the role of politics and migration, for example, or the question of health, or the question of procedural justice. Those are not objects of my own research, and therefore others are better placed than myself to answer. But I think they are the three. You put really the discussion on three very important elements. Maybe starting by the question of migration and the role of migration, the role of climate change on migration, and yeah, I would point you to the work of Hélène Benveniste. I don't know if you know her. She is based in Stanford now. She is really an expert on climate change and migration. She is looking at who moves, who can move, who cannot move, how climate change has changed and will change, who moves and who can move, and where to, also, and how migration is or is not an adaptation, and how it changes also the vulnerability of the societies that stay, and how borders and migration restriction policies are limiting adaptation and increasing vulnerability. So really, I would encourage you to read her work, and probably that's an entry point to also other work on the topic that is a very important one. Then on health, health is a huge topic. It's been looked at, like the intersection between health and climate change has mainly been looked at on the impact side, so rather in IPCC language, a working group 2. So looking at the impacts, vulnerability and adaptation issues, a bit less in the mitigation. In last IPCC cycle in working group 2 report, there's a chapter 7 on health. So there again, that's really an entry point to the topic. If you want to dig further in that topic, I would point to next IPCC report that will be published, hopefully, hopefully in 2028, and we can discuss why I'm saying hopefully. But there's also a chapter 20 that will be on poverty, livelihoods, mobility, and fragility, and where I think both the questions of migration and the questions of health will be treated, and I expect some very important messages to come out from that chapter, and I also hope that some literature will be published in the coming years to support that chapter. Maybe on health also, what's important, and it is a bit less looked at, is the part on the links between climate change mitigation and health. And there's some research that, why it's important, because at least in a country like France, and looking at the public debate on climate change, well, maybe it's not always better on health issues, but it also bringing the question of health talks more closely to the everyday life and to the concerns of citizens, and so linking the discussion about climate change and climate mitigation to health question, I think, is important. And there's some research showing that a number of mitigation action has strong health co-benefits. That's, for example, the reduction of meat in diets in countries like France, where the average diet is for nutritional reasons too meat intensive and causing public health issues, and so that's one. And also policies to encourage active mobility have both some climate benefits, some benefits to improve local air quality that has some health questions, and also reduce sedentarity. That is a way of a paradox to suffer from sedentarity in societies of hypermobility in a way. But yeah, so linking health and climate change, I think, is a very important part of the discussion we need to have. And then the last point on procedural justice. This is not my own expertise. I read about it, and I think it's very much connected to distributive justice. If you don't have procedural justice, you don't have, because the process and the way decisions are made, and who is around the table, and who has the power to influence decision actually shapes the outcome of the decision. So yes, and yes, that's critical. One individual's research is not changing the world. I hope it's not making it a worse place. At least sometimes I'm worried also on possible misuses of some of the research, in particular when you start looking at the inequality and exposure and vulnerability to some climate change impacts that is of interest for like the insurance sector is looking into that, and there could be some misuses of that research that would actually increase the vulnerability of the people who are more exposed and vulnerable if their insurance price would be raised, or if they would be excluded from insurance. So yeah, that's something that I think everyone who works on climate change has that sort of question in mind, and trying to have an impact is also going out of the academic world, and that's what I try to do as much as time allows. And so, yeah, outreach, for example, but also contributing to IPCC, to collective work that have maybe some impact, like IPCC or the Haut Conseil pour le Climat in France, and more broadly, there's also some alliances, I think, to build between research and other professions, with journalists, for example, with artists as well. Because alone researchers have a smaller impact than an alliance with others.
We'll collect a few questions.
Hello, my name is Marlene. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it was very precise and succinct, and I just want to start by saying that I think maybe your research alone doesn't change the whole world, but I'm sure it's an important piece of the puzzle. So thank you for your work. I want to ask a question about also gender justice, because I saw in the beginning that you mentioned a lot of different terms or like types of inequality, and I read a lot also about like gender inequality of climate change, and I was wondering how you decided to not include it in this analysis, or yeah. And a second question maybe was around, because you said like France is a special case in terms of their expenditure share of regressive and progressive in energy and housing and transport, and I was wondering why. Thanks.
Okay, thanks. First, thank you for your presentation. My question was already Marlene did it, so I'm going to switch and ask you if you can elaborate a bit more in this fear of the mislead use of research, because I don't know if I fully understood that part. And also, we were talking about, they were mentioned these climate displaced populations who are structurally excluded from national welfare states. Until what extent do you think that's represent a fundamental limitation for redistribution-based approach to climate justice, taking into account that they are out of most of the national laws?
Hi, my name is Leo from Germany. Thank you so much for your presentation here. I also have two small questions. I think one is related to the part which Florian presented and about like reasonable disagreement, and I'm kind of interested about it because intuitively, like, maybe it's a bit of a pessimistic view, but I feel like when I think about global decision-making processes, I think the first dimensions along which I think about them is like power and influence, and I think especially when like you hear stories of past COPs where like McKinsey like took over and kind of in many processes also like made decisions. I'm kind of wondering to what degree the fact that many decisions are maybe not made in a way that we as researchers would love to, then how much is that related to reasonable disagreement, how much is it related to power structures? And I know it's like a super big question and it probably differs from global to local level and whatever, but I'm wondering if you have like maybe hints on that. And the second one was on one diagram, the literature review diagram, and I was wondering what the category other denoted, because the categories were like progressive effects of climate change, regressive effects, and then like neutral or mixed effects, and then I was wondering what is left. So what do the other find for effects? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe we can take a first round of answer. And there was water also in the category water. The other section was very large in the.
Is everything we do. Yeah, thank you very much for your questions. So on gender justice and gender inequality, again, this is not a topic I'm an expert in, so I don't have like research on the topic. I know there is a lot of research on the topic, both on the questions of gender inequality and exposure and vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. For example, we know that women are more, especially old women, are all more vulnerable to heat waves. And there's a lot of research into that, and interestingly that element of knowledge led a group of old women from Switzerland to launch a case against their state, saying that because you don't have adequate climate policies, we're not protected. And there's many dimensions and reasons along the question of differential exposure and vulnerability to impacts of climate change. Sometimes it's in the other direction, looking at, well, it depends in the countries, but looking at who works outdoor. For example, it can be in some countries mainly men. So it can go both ways, and it's important to look into the question. Then also when looking at mitigation policies and gender, looking at who is, for example, energy poor, and how mitigation policies increase or reduce energy poverty has some implication on gender question, especially women who are alone with kids, for example, who are disproportionately dependent on transport. So there are also some dimensions there. Then going to precisely transport and France and what I was saying. So in a majority of countries, when you look at the budget share for transport according to income levels, the median, there's also a lot of variation across the different income levels, and that's like what we call horizontal inequality, and that's a big part also. But the median in many countries is increasing with income. In France, it's not the case. It's about flat. So that's why some carbon pricing, for example, in France, as we have, and which one of the things that triggered the Yellow Vest movement, that like there was this this sort of injustice in the increase of the carbon tax in France that is regressive for the transport part in France compared to what happens in other countries. So yeah, that's why there's something. Well, other European countries also have that feature, but that's not the case in India, China, or Then on misuses of research, I was referring to if you have some research that shows that you have specific locations or specific households who are more exposed and more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, that if the insurance sector is not regulated well, that information can be used by insurance companies to raise the price of insurance for people living in those locations or with those characteristics, or even exclude them from access to insurance. So this is an example of a misuse, well, I mean, a use of research that would in fact contribute to increase vulnerability and increase inequality, even if the first intention was to document inequality. Then on reasonable disagreement and power and influence on decisions. Well, I think, but maybe you would also want to answer, and maybe I'll give you as well. But at least in how international negotiations on climate change mitigation were happening, this framing of the negotiation saying, okay, we have to limit emissions to a certain level and then decide who can emit what, sort of that's really a sharing a cake sort of negotiation. And that is, if you frame things like this, if someone has more, someone has less, right? And of course, agreeing on what is a fair share, a fair way of sharing, is almost impossible because the countries have different views of what would be fair. And I think that's what you were referring to. At least that's really why the international negotiation failed in the COP in Copenhagen in 2009. Then on the question of power and influence, I'm not the right person to answer to that question. You have a lot of research that is documenting the excessive power of some companies and some individuals on the climate question, both at the international level and on national debates and policies and yeah. Yeah. And then you had some more specific questions about like the paper and what was in other. If I remember correctly, that other is when the paper was showing that a specific group is like suffers more losses than other groups, but that those groups are not different in income levels. So there's no conclusion on whether that increases income inequality, but that's on other dimensions. And I think I'm more or less, but maybe you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I can just say that this idea of reasonable disagreement doesn't mean that you assume the actors actually are reasonable or that they are not self-interested. But it's more like, even if they would be reasonable, then you could still have the potential for disagreement, and therefore this is like an additional barrier to reach an agreement. Yeah.
I'm posing a question for Hannah. So this is Hannah from Austria, and she lost her voice, so I'm talking. So this is a bit outside of what we discussed, but Hannah's still curious. So the intergenerational inequality, which is justice toward not yet born people, was mentioned in the beginning of your presentation. And this concept is often used by advocates of effective altruism, long-termism, and justifies their investment in things like high-risk AI and anti-democratic yet big influence projects. How should climate economy work represent the welfare of future generations through like discounting equity weight, rights-based constraints, and without creating some kind of excuse for elite-driven technocratic governance? And I also have a I'm Elo, also from Austria, and I also have a question. You said that we should ask you about technicalities, and I have a question about technicalities. In the beginning, you started with a statistic on how the world would be, I think, 45% less unequal if it weren't for climate change. And I wanted to ask how you came to that specific number and how you were able to isolate these like massive structural shock that climate change is. So yeah.
And when you do this comparison between models, you have access to the models and you can play with them, or?
Thank you for your presentation. I'm Daniela from Colombia. I would like to ask you particularly about something you mentioned, and I would take on the strength from Elu, something very specific about something that you presented from the systematic review, so the first study, particularly regarding the progressive effect of certain channels, and you talked about the physical channel. Does this consider insurance? Because certain and particularly low-income groups may not be insured at all, so losses and the way of counteracting those can be very different from people with high income. And I would like to understand if in this case the progressive effect does consider that, or is merely from the losses themselves without insurance.
Okay, so we will take the last two questions.
Hello, thanks for your presentation. I'm Leo from Brazil. We had a seminar, I think last week or the week before, with someone who is doing research on the role of management consultancies on the climate debate, especially McKinsey, and how they have this power of, like this invisible power of setting up the language and the debate. And I think they also work as like an external agent, like providing common grounds, but in a different way, I would say. So I'd like to know, like the impact they have on IPCC, if they do, maybe in taking taking attention out of IPCC, maybe, and even if there's some people that travel between both. Yeah, that's it.
Hello, I'm Luis from Germany. My question is like, do you think you should or could also address policies that are redistribution policies and could have indirect positive effects on climate mitigation, and like how far this could be possible? I mean, especially in Europe, there's a lot of research on the social pillars of Europe and so on that could potentially have positive effects on or negative effects on climate change. Yeah, like it's good.
You have one? Okay.
Hello, I'm Theo from Germany. I have a question because in my personal experience, also in the last semester in South Africa, I made the experience that sometimes it's people that are coming from the one of the most vulnerable countries in the world that still uphold or still try to pursue an economy that is basically destroying the basis of their existence. And do you think that's due to a lack of awareness, or is it maybe, or what else could it be? Is it like a lack of communication also, or what should have been changed in the way of communicating these vulnerabilities to people so it leads to proper action?
Okay, very last.
Okay, Hannah has another question. So the EU is now shifting towards their financial capacity towards military spending and the security sector. And where do you see the biggest bottlenecks in EU financing plan, but also do you have some words on the biggest hope or like positive foresight in EU transformation capabilities and actual actions that could be undertaken?
Okay, so you want hope from me. So your first question on intergenerational inequality, and that is how that is sometimes taken as an excuse for elite-driven technocratic governance. Yeah, again, that's that can be the sort of misuse of research. There are other examples. For example, the research that is done on the risks of tipping points in the climate system is, by some actors, used to justify geoengineering. And yeah, as researchers, we have to be careful. Okay. To try to break that link that is made, and but it's not easy, and it's all the more complicated in media settings, for example, where you don't have a lot of time, a lot of words to explain things with some nuance. And if you explain things with nuance, it's also not helping much. So I think on that it's still useful and needed to show how climate change is creating intergenerational inequality massively, and that is a reason to act on climate change. Yeah, and I'm sorry for the elite technocratic bros. There's not much I can do for them. Yeah. On your technical question on the 45%. So that I was showing an example of an econometric paper that is not a paper I'm a co-author of, but you have the reference, and you can look into. I was giving some before doing the systematic review. That is something that is a little abstract and a little dry. I wanted to show some examples of results of some specific papers, and this is one of them. But yeah. Then on your question, whether in modeling in intercomparison projects, whether we have access to models, the we needs to be defined there. How it works is that it's really in collaborative projects where teams meet and work together, but each modeling team has its own model and is running its own model. And there's like the coordinator of, or the coordinating group of the modeling project that is centralizing all the results, checking with each of the team, oh, this is strange, are you sure, can you check, and things like that. But there's we don't have everyone running everyone's model. Although in the climate research communities in general, there's a very strong push towards open science, and most of the models are now open source. Sometimes, even though they are open source, they're not used by others, also because there's a cost to learn how to use the models, but they are more and more open. Then on your question about whether the papers that find sometimes a progressive effect of the impacts of climate change because they destroy physical assets that are mainly owned by wealthy individuals, I would need to check all the papers. the one I read, because we share when we do a systematic review. We're multiple co-authors, and the general practice is to have like 2 of the co-authors read every papers, but all co-authors don't read all the papers, and so I didn't read all of them, but the ones I read, as far as I remember, do not consider insurance. So it weakens also that effect. There might be some of the papers that look at that precisely, but yeah. Then on your question on the role of consultancy, and whether it has an impact on IPCC. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know of like the authors of IPCC reports are like remain paid by their institutions, and the majority of us are academic researchers. Small numbers can be employed by some companies, some non-NGOs type or think tank type of, but that's the minority. I haven't checked if there's someone who would be from a big consulting firm, but I don't know of anyone. Then there's a question of how those firms use IPCC elements and maybe cherry pick some IPCC elements to build a specific discourse that is different from the scientific consensus, and that I would have to check. But yeah. Then I think someone had a question on the effect of like redistributive policies that have like the first aim of reducing inequalities, and what are the impacts of such policies on emissions. Again, I would have to look into more recent literature on that. When I was involved in last IPCC report, so the one that was on mitigation, the one that was published in 22, I was involved in the group that looked at precisely like the literature that was looking at that. There was a small number of papers, I would say maybe 10 papers or so, looking at those. The direction of the effect was not a consensus. Some papers were finding that redistribution in some contexts increase emissions, but in other contexts, other papers were finding the opposite direction. However, in both cases, the size of the effect was not huge. So, yeah. Now I'm forgetting, there was something about communication to lead to meaningful action, and maybe the paradox that some of the societies who are the more vulnerable to climate change aspire to development that is mimicking the development that is precisely causing climate change. On that, again, it's not my own research, but my personal view is probably that communicating on vulnerabilities and impacts is not leading to meaningful action, and rather communicating on what you can gain from different development paths could lead to more action. So, yeah. Also, in countries like France, some communication that is more positive of what you can actually gain is probably leading to more action. And then on some hope and EU. Well, I mean, in that whole climate change question, I think EU has a role to play, and it could be one place where we could show that it's possible to live well in societies that have a low climate change impact, and probably it could be like the responsibility that we could take in more direct geopolitical self-interest of EU, including security issue. Well, I mean, EU is dependent on fossil fuels, and so phasing out fossil fuels is a security question also. So also framing like this, the topic might help EU move faster, yeah, on the topic.